Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling spondyloarthropathies, or SPA for short. We're using a really detailed guide, sort of like a cheat sheet aimed at medical students.
Right. And our goal is to pull out the really key insights for you.
We want you to come away with a solid handle on what these conditions are, what makes them tick, and why they're significant.
Exactly. It's a fascinating group of diseases.
Okay, so first things first, what exactly are spondyloarthropathies in simple terms?
Well, they're basically a group of inflammatory rheumatic diseases. Think inflammation.
Okay.
And they mainly go after the axial skeleton. That's your spine. And importantly, the sacroiliac joints where the spine meets the pelvis.
But not just the spine, right?
No, that's a key point.
Yeah.
They can hit peripheral joints too, arms, legs, and even other parts of the body. We're talking eyes, skin, sometimes the gut. It's quite varied.
And the main symptoms people notice?
Pain and stiffness, especially in the spine and those sacroiliac joints. It's often progressive and can be really quite painful.
Who tends to get this? Is there a typical age?
Yeah, the onset is usually before age 45. It affects both men and women, though maybe slightly differently depending on the specific type.
And is it common?
Surprisingly so. The prevalence is actually pretty similar to rheumatoid arthritis, maybe around 0.5 to almost 2% of the population.
Wow, okay. And you mentioned it affects other areas, eyes, gut, so it's systemic.
Definitely systemic. The inflammation isn't just, stuck in one joint. It's a broader immune system thing.
So how does SPA differ from, say, rheumatoid arthritis, which people might be more familiar with?
Good question. A major difference is the rheumatoid factor test.
Hmm.
Most people with SPA are seronegative, meaning they don't have that rheumatoid factor antibody in their blood.
Which is common in RTRA.
Exactly. And here's maybe the most crucial distinction. The primary site of inflammation. In STIDE, a hallmark feature is enthesitis.
Enthesitis, remind me.
That's inflammation, right, where tendons and ligaments actually attach into the bone. Think Achilles tendon insertion, places like that.
Ah, okay. Not the joint lining itself.
Right. Rheumatoid arthritis is primarily characterized by synovitis. That's inflammation of the synovium, the lining inside the joint capsule. SPA is more about those attachment points, the entheses.
Got it. Enthesitis is key. So despite the different types of SPA, are there common threads that tie them together?
Absolutely. There are several shared features. Involvement of the axial skeleton spine and sacroiliac joints is common across the group.
Okay.
Peripheral joint involvement is also frequent, but it's often asymmetric, meaning it affects, say, one knee but not the other, and tends to favor the lower limbs.
And enthesitis, you mentioned?
Yes, enthesitis is a big one. Also dactylitis. That's where a whole finger or toe swells up, looking kind of like a sausage.
Sausage digits, right?
Then there's the genetic link, a strong association with the HLA-B27 gene.
We'll probably come back to that.
Definitely. And finally, that characteristic inflammatory back pain. It's typically worse at night or first thing in the morning, and crucially, it tends to improve with gentle exercise or activity, unlike mechanical back pain.
Okay, so SPA is the umbrella. Let's break down the main categories under it. How are they classified?
Sure. We basically split them into two main groups based on where the primary symptoms are. There's axial SPA or AXSPA.
Focusing on the spine.
Exactly. Spine and sacroiliac joints. And then there's peripheral SPA, PSPA, where the main issues are in the peripheral joints or entheses limbs, basically.
Let's start with axial SPA then.
Okay. Within AXSPA, there are two main forms. First is radiographic AXSPA, which you might know better as ankylosing spondylitis, or AS.
Radiographic meaning?
Meaning you can see characteristic changes, like damage or fusion in the sacroiliac joints or spine on standard x-rays. S typically starts in those sacroiliac joints and can progress upwards along the spine.
Leading to fusion.
Potentially, yes. Over time, new bone can form, bridging the vertebrae, which can lead to significant stiffness, impaired spinal movement, and changes in posture. There's also a link to increased cardiovascular risk with AS.
And genetics.
Very strong genetic component. High heritability and a really strong link to HLA-B27, especially in certain populations. Though, importantly, having HLA-B27 doesn't automatically mean you'll get AS.
When does AS usually start?
Typically in person's 20s.
And the other type of axial SPA?
That's non-radiographic AXSPA or NRAXSPA. Here, people have similar symptoms, inflammatory back pain, stiffness, and you can often see inflammation on an MRI scan, but those characteristic changes aren't necessarily visible on x-rays yet.
So same disease process, just earlier or less severe bone changes.
Kind of. It's debated whether it's always just early AS or sometimes a distinct path. The male-to-female ratio also seems to differ a bit between the radiographic and non-radiographic forms.
Are there specific criteria for diagnosing these?
Yes, there are classification criteria, like the Modified New York criteria primarily for AS and the ASAS criteria, which incorporate clinical signs, HLA-B27 status, and imaging findings, including MRI for NRX-SPA.
And can XPA affect things outside the joints?
Oh, definitely. Extraarticular manifestations are common. Things like uveitis inflammation in the eye, inflammatory bowel disease, psoriasis, enthesitis, dactylitis. Less commonly, cardiac or lung issues. Osteoporosis and fractures are also risks, and depression is unfortunately common too.
Okay, that covers axial. What about peripheral spondyloarthritis, PSPA?
Right, so here the main action is outside the spine, though the spine can still be involved sometimes. A major one is psoriatic arthritis, or PSA.
Linked to psoriasis, the skin condition.
Exactly. PSA can affect peripheral joints, the spine, entheses, skin, and nails. It's really variable. There are actually 5 sort of classic patterns described, from affecting just the end joints of the fingers, to mimicking rheumatoid arthritis, to a more asymmetric pattern, which is quite common, to involving the spine, or even a very destructive form called arthritis mutulans.
Wow, quite a range.
It is. Key features are often that inflammation at insertions points, enthesitis, and dactylitis. You'll also look for the skin or nail signs of psoriasis, though sometimes the arthritis appears before the skin condition. HLA-B27 is associated, but less strongly than in AS. Onset is often a bit later, maybe 30s to 50s.
Any other key types of PSPA?
Yes. There's reactive arthritis, REA. This one develops after an infection, typically in the gastrointestinal tract or the genitourinary system.
So, triggered by an infection.
Precisely. It usually presents as an oligoarthritis, meaning fewer than 5 joints involved, often asymmetric, and mainly in the lower limbs. You can also see enthesitis, dactylitis, and inflammatory back pain.
Is there a classic presentation?
There's a classic triad, though not everyone gets all 3. Urethritis, inflammation of the urethra, conjunctivitis, eye inflammation, and arthritis. Skin manifestations can also occur. HLA-B27 is more common in people who develop REA, usually affects young adults, maybe 1 to 6 weeks after the initial infection.
How's that diagnosed?
Based on the clinical picture, that triad, the joint pattern, history of a preceding infection, you have to rule out actual infection in the joint septic arthritis.
Okay, what else falls under peripheral SPA?
Enteropathic arthritis, or ENA. This occurs specifically in people who already have inflammatory bowel disease, IBD, like Crohn's disease, or ulcerative colitis.
So arthritis linked to gut inflammation.
Exactly. It primarily affects peripheral joints, again, often lower limbs. There seems to be a pattern where women might have more peripheral involvement and men more axial, but varies. The arthritis symptoms can sometimes flare up when the IBD flares, but not always. HLA-B27 association is present here too. Diagnosis relies on finding the arthritis pattern in someone with known IBD.
Then you mentioned undifferentiated.
Right. Undifferentiated spondyloarthritis, USPA. This is basically a category for people who clearly have features of SPA, like inflammatory back pain, maybe some enthesitis or peripheral arthritis, but they don't quite meet the full criteria for AS, PSA, RAA, or ENA.
Kind of a catch-all.
In a way, yes. Often involves fewer than 5 joints. The knee is common. Symptoms like inflammatory back pain, buttock pain, enthesitis are very frequent in this group. HLA-B27 is positive in maybe a quarter of cases. It can be tricky to diagnose, but you consider it when the SPA picture seems likely but doesn't fit neatly elsewhere.
And finally, juvenile SPA.
Yes, JSPA. This just means SPA starting before the age of 16. It's not one single entity, but includes subtypes like enthesitis-related arthritis, which is a big one in kids, juvenile AS, juvenile PSA, and arthritis associated with IBD.
How does it look in kids?
Often starts with pain and inflammation in the lower body joints, hips, knees, ankles. Enthesitis is very common, like heel pain. The spine might get involved later. Eye inflammation, uveitis is also a concern. HLA-B27 is frequently present. Diagnosis can be challenging because symptoms vary and x-rays might not show much early on.
Okay, that's a lot of different conditions under one umbrella. It leads to the big question, why does this happen? What's the underlying process, the pathogenesis?
Yeah, the million-dollar question. And the honest answer is, it's not fully understood. It's complex.
But we know some things.
We do. We know it's fundamentally about inflammation driven by the immune system. Often, these are considered autoimmune diseases, where the body's immune system mistakenly attacks its own tissues.
And enthesitis seems central.
It does. The primary pathology often seems to be at the entheses. Immune cells, like certain types of T cells and macrophages, gather there. Key inflammatory messenger molecules, Cytokines, particularly TNF-alpha and IL-17, play a huge role in driving the inflammation and also the subsequent fibrosis and new bone formation, that ossification we see in AS.
So both parts of the immune system are involved, innate and adaptive.
Yes, it seems like both the rapid response innate system and the more targeted adaptive immune system are involved.
And the genetic factor, HLA-B27.
It's a massive genetic risk factor. Something like 80 to 95% of people with AS in some populations have this gene.
But you said having the gene doesn't guarantee the disease.
Correct. Many people have HLA-B27 and never develop CA. So it's clearly not the whole story. There have to be other factors, other genes, environmental triggers.
Are there theories about how HLA-B27 contributes?
Several hypotheses. One involves how HLA-B27 presents fragments of proteins, peptides, to immune cells, maybe presenting a peptide that triggers the autoimmune attack. Another idea involves the HLA-B27 protein itself misfolding inside the cell, causing stress and triggering inflammatory pathways, particularly involving another cytokine called IL-23. There's also a theory about specific forms of HLA-B27 interacting directly with other immune cells like NK cells.
You mentioned IL-23 and IL-17. Is that pathway important?
Hugely important. The IL-23-IL-17 axis is now recognized as central to SPA pathogenesis. IL-23 helps activate a type of T cell called Th17, and these cells produce lots of IL-17, which is highly inflammatory and drives many features of SPA. This pathway is actually a major target for newer biologic therapies.
Interesting. Any other key players in the cause?
Well, there's growing interest in the gut microbiome, the trillions of bacteria living in our intestines.
The gut, how does that connect?
The idea, sometimes called the gut joint axis, is that in genetically susceptible individuals, like those with HLA-B27, changes in the gut microbiome, or perhaps increased gut permeability allowing bacterial products to leak out, might trigger or perpetuate the systemic inflammation that manifests as SPA. The link with IBD and enteropathic arthritis is perhaps the clearest example of this connection.
Okay, let's try to pull this together. Spondyloarthropathies, they're a varied group. Inflammatory, often targeting the spine and those tendon ligament attachments, the entheses. They're different from rheumatoid arthritis, especially being seronegative and having that enthesitis feature.
Right.
They share things like inflammatory back pain, the HLA-B27 link, and include specific types like AS, PSA, reactive, enteropathic, undifferentiated, and juvenile forms.
You got it.
And the why is complex, a mix of strong genetic predisposition, like HLA-B27, problems in the immune system involving key pathways like TNF and IL-23, IL-17, and possibly environmental triggers, maybe even involving our gut bacteria.
That sums it up nicely. It really underscores how intricate these chronic inflammatory conditions are. Understanding these distinctions in the systemic nature is, I think, really valuable for anyone interested in health or the immune system.
So here's a final thought to leave you with. We know HLA-B27 is a major player, but most people with the gene don't get SPA. What are those other factors? What specific environmental exposures or maybe other subtle genetic variations are the missing pieces needed to actually flip the switch and trigger these conditions in someone who's susceptible?
That's exactly where a lot of research is focused right now, trying to unravel that complex interplay.
Really fascinating stuff. Thanks for diving deep into